All right, we fire off on a new chapter with new information, the introduction to the U.S. federal bureaucracy. In almost every survey textbook for American government, bureaucracy is given its own chapter in the larger section on the branches of government, which may seem odd because that would make four chapters on branches, but only three branches of government. I'm going to explain that discrepancy a little bit today in what effectively is a two-part series of notes. If you're watching the recording, they're in two parts. My supposition is if you're in class hearing this at some point, if you heard this live, I guess to use the proper terminology, you would have heard just one note. So they would have seamed together. But to understand the federal bureaucracy, we have to start from the very beginning. The very beginning, of course, is the U.S. Constitution. So the federal bureaucracy as a entity, as a what sometimes is referred to as the fourth branch or the administrative branch of government, exists because of just 10 words. And those 10 words are buried at the end of Article 2, Section 3 of the U.S. Constitution. Now, Article 2, Section 3, pretty important. Article 2, Section 3 lays out sort of the responsibilities of the president and the powers inherent in the office. I mean, that's a pretty big deal. At the end of Article 2, Section 3, there are these 10 words. He shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. I'm mentally counting right now to make sure I got it right. Yep, it's 10 words. Good. Now, what does this mean? It means that the job of the president is to execute the laws that Congress passes and the president assents to with his signature. In other words, Congress passing the law is only part of the journey of a piece of legislation. Now it actually has to be carried out. It has to be made into policy. And that job is the job of the executive branch. It is, according to the Constitution, the job of the president. But here's where practicality comes in. There is no way working 24 hours a day, working 7 days a week, working 365 days a year, that any single human could manage the entirety of the federal government. It just couldn't be done. The job is too big. Even back in the early days of the Republic, when the size and scope of the federal government's responsibilities admittedly were considerably smaller, it couldn't be done. So that's why the agencies that make up the federal bureaucracy exist in the first place, because the president delegates to these various agencies and commissions and departments the job of actually executing the laws. His job as president is to have oversight over those people. And that's something we'll get into as we get into this chapter a little bit. But the concept here is that the job of the president, among other things, being the leader of the republic in terms of being the visual leader of the country, setting the vision for how the country should move forward, and being the head of state, is also a manager of the government. And that is one of their primary jobs, as the Constitution verifies by saying that he shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Okay, so what is it exactly that the bureaucracy does? Well, they do a few different things. Executing the law can take on a lot of different forms. Here are three of the primary tasks that the federal bureaucracies handle. And we're going to spend a good bit of time here in a minute on one of them, which is the first one, the idea of regulation. Regulation is the creation of rules and procedures and processes, would be another word, to help ensure laws are executed the way that they are intended. In other words, you say that you want to, I'll pick a random law. You want to see to it that all third graders can read at an acceptable level by the year 2025, which is similar laws like that have been passed in past history. Okay. Well, that law, a government mandate, if you want to call it that, is just that. Hey, you should do this. What it doesn't say is, well, shit, doesn't say a lot of things. For example, what classifies as a third grader having adequate reading skills? Is there an exam? Who's going to write it? What will be decided to be a passing grade on it? Who is going to administer it? How? Who's going to grade it? How? Again, what is going to be the reward or the penalty for schools that cannot get an adequate number of their students to reach that level? What is an adequate level? You're never going to get 100%, despite the goal of the law. It's a statistical improbability. So what would be an acceptable percentage? 90%, 80%, 82.6%, who knows, right? That's the job of a government agency. In this case, almost certainly the U.S. Department of Education, to say, okay, here is how we're going to measure as a benchmark of somebody reading at an adequate level in the third grade. Here's the type of exam we will give, maybe a reading comprehension exam online, not that dissimilar from our CAS testing that y'all endured last year. And so it goes to a bureaucracy, whether it's the California Department of Education at the state level or the U.S. Department of Education at the federal level, to lay out the rules and the procedures. You're going to give this test sometime in this window of time, which, by the way, is a rule. The CAS testing has to be between two dates. We're right at the tail end of it because we have so many kids that take AP exams. A lot of that window actually is during the AP exams, which wasn't really terribly well thought out by the state of California, but that's neither here nor there. And then making sure it gets carried out. Okay, here's the parameters, here's the rules, here's what the instrument looks like. We're probably going to have to do more than one version so people don't cheat and so forth and so on. Then the second stage of bureaucratic function is enforcement. Bureaucracies are going to be tasked with the often difficult job of actually doing the work to make sure that the regulations and the rules set out before are actually followed. So let's talk about something like, to use an example from U.S. history that everybody should be somewhat familiar with, food safety. If you had U.S. history, you probably talked a little bit about the Progressive era, might even read a little something from The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, or talked about it, and know that in the Progressive era was a time when the government came in to be an active participant in making sure that big business lived and operated under a certain set of rules. Well, rules are great, but if rules are never enforced, then they're no longer rules. It doesn't take long for a savvy businessman to figure out if a rule is not being enforced, and then they don't enforce it, right? And then they don't enforce it, they don't follow it. An example of this would be there's a reason why people generally try to adhere to something close to the speed limit, right? Not going to lie and say everyone adheres to the speed limit, because by golly they don't. But if you've ever done a long drive, and I've had a few in recent times, longest one being in one shot 875 miles between Navarro County, Texas and El Paso, Texas. Actually, I take that back. It was Lordsburg, New Mexico. Yeah. You definitely want to speed if you can, because you want to get the hell out of the car at some point. Why don't you? Why wasn't, I mean, it's Interstate 10. It's a big old interstate. A lot of it's through uninhabited desert and scrub. There are parts I could easily hit. Well, I was driving a Dodge Durango, so 105 might be a tad ambitious, but I could easily hit 100. Why didn't I? Well, because I didn't want to get pulled over and get a ticket, because tickets are really expensive, particularly if you're getting one from out of state, having done that before. If I knew that if the Texas and New Mexico Highway Patrol were on strike and I knew that nobody was going to be patrolling the roads, oh my gosh, I don't know how fast a Dodge Durango can go, but we were going to find out. So enforcement's a huge part of the lawmaking, law creation process. There has to be mechanisms put in place to make sure that people are actually going to follow the rules. And that too falls on the bureaucracy. So in the case of traffic laws, that falls on your local police department or the California Highway Patrol, right? So if you're driving up through the Central Valley and the temptation to go through there at 150 miles an hour is pretty stout, California Highway Patrol patrols it regularly. Where was I just recently? Oh, I was in Pennsylvania over the summer for a teaching conference, and I was blown away by how many Pennsylvania state police I saw anchored on the interstate, just waiting for somebody to go too fast or make a mistake. Gotta have that. It's annoying if you're talking about vehicular stuff, but you gotta have it. Last but not least, bureaucracies are often portals of information. Uh, and that, by the way, that information goes two directions. One, a lot of these agencies are tasked with the responsibility of reporting information to the president and his staff, as it says here on the slide. And that is important. The president of the United States needs to know how the government's functioning. He goes to these bureaucracies, and they have people whose job it is to be chronicling this stuff. So they can know you can go to the agriculture department and say, how is this year going in terms of production of soybeans? And they will tell you because they keep track of these things. Now, one thing that's not on the screen but is important is bureaucracies also function as portals of information for us as citizens. So I'll give you one example because I dealt with it this summer as well, which is when you're traveling abroad. One thing that the government provides, specifically the U.S. State Department, is they provide travel warnings. They will quite literally, you can go look up, they're available online, and one of the jobs they do is they monitor criminal events in other countries, particularly those targeting foreign tourists, and they say, hey, yeah, you probably don't want to go to this one place right now because there's a lot of domestic unrest there. Or you may want to not go here because there's a history of ill treatment of Americans. I think North Korea has quite literally been on the State Department watch list since 1953. Okay? But, for example, there are certain states in Mexico where the State Department advises do not go there or exercise extreme caution before you go there. At one point last year being the year 2022, there was actually an extended State Department warning of the border states. And at the time, my older daughter actually had a friend that lived right across the border in Tecate, and it was like the State Department basically was telling Katie, you might not want to go there right now. Because there was a bit of a fight, I don't know what the hell you'd call it. It was something less than a war, but something more than a spat between some of the narco gangs of northern Mexico and the local police. So they were like hijacking buses and setting them on fire to cause traffic disruptions and things of that nature. This was in Tijuana, Tecate, Mexicali, the whole 9 yards. And it was like, okay, this is not a good time to take a trip there. So that is a piece of information. That is a bit of research that the government does on our behalf. Now, as I said, today our focus is going to be on regulations. So what is a regulation? Sorry if there's an odd stoppage there. It's because I had to pry some garbage from my dog's mouth. It was lovely. Being a dog dad is a never-ending gig. Anyways, a regulation is a rule that government puts in place to make an individual or business behave in a certain way. It goes to the slide we just talked about, right? So you have this new law or this new rule. You're going to need procedures and rules put in place, and that's what we call regulations. Okay, this is what is a minimum acceptable standard of literacy. This is the measurement we're going to use. This is how we arrived at that measurement. This is how you are to assess. This is the benchmark assessments you should do along the way, and so forth and so on, right? Now, regulations generally exist for one of two reasons. Reason number one is to comply with new laws. So there's a new literacy law passed by the government. It gets deferred to the Department of Education, who then goes about the business of saying, okay, we have this new law. Here is how we're going to carry that law out. Sure. Now, that is some of the regulating process. Some of it doesn't go through the process of complying with a newly written law. Sometimes, and as you can see, quite regularly, new regulations are created to respond to lawsuits. And I'll give you an example. It's not a happy example. This goes back to the early 1980s. And there was a tremendous health scare that arose from a terrible event that happened. I want to say it was in Utah or Colorado. It was one of the two. Where several people got ill, and I believe a couple actually died, from taking Tylenol that had been tainted, had been tampered with by someone prying open the lid and doing whatever evil deeds they did with it. And the people got very sick, and like I said, I think a couple actually died. From that, the Food and Drug Administration, which is part of the Department of Agriculture, it is one of the organizations of the federal bureaucracy, issued new regulations, not even waiting for the federal law process to go into effect, because this was literally a matter of life and death. They issued new regulations that any commercial over-the-counter medication had to have certain safety measures put in. One was the lid couldn't just be pried off, so now you got the ones where you have to put weight on it, turn it, or, combination lock or whatever. I'm kidding about the combination lock part. But you have to have a seal over the top of it now so that somebody buying medication can take it home, open it, and see it's been tampered with. That's an example. Another example, a Colorado State University study in the late 90s found that the average fast food hamburger has 41,000 regulations on it. Now, this is state and federal regulations, and a lot of them are redundant. But by redundant, I mean the same regulation exists in 26 states, and federally, that's 27 regulations, but they all say the same thing. But there are some real buttes in there. There are some that are obvious, how long meat can be kept before it has to be thrown out by the restaurant, what temperature the refrigeration needs to be at. Does the place have to close immediately if the refrigeration breaks? State of California, the answer to that is absolutely freaking yes. There are some other ones that are honestly far, far more silly. Pickle width. On the surface seems like a silly one. I believe the metric is that your pickles have to be somewhere between 1/8 and 3/16 of an inch thick. Your pickle slices. Now, you may go, oh, wow, they're really getting into the weeds on this one, but there's actually real problems both ways. On the low end of that would be fraud. You ask for pickles on your burger, and they put a wafer-thin pickle slice on your burger, and you're being defrauded. The contrary is even worse. Anything thicker than 3/16 of an inch, you're starting to look at it being, for children, a potential choking hazard. So there's reasons for that. There's ones about the amount of thiamine that needs to be in the bun. But my personal favorite, and it's my favorite because I got this damn thing memorized, is ketchup cannot be considered grade A restaurant quality ketchup unless it flows no more than 9 centimeters in 30 seconds on an inclined plane of 45 degrees in a room maintained at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius. I shit you not. You talk about your bad part-time jobs, right? Some dude is in the freaking laboratory. You ready in there, Bob? Ready, Saul. Dude breaks out measuring tape, looks at his watch. Breaks out the measuring tape again, looks at his watch. Does it again, 6 centimeters, 6.5, 6 3/4, looks at his watch. 30 seconds, we're good. There's his job, dude. That is his role in life. He is the ketchup flow guy. Nice. Now that one's silly. Others aren't. I mean, obviously, if you ingest food that's tainted, it can kill you. Welcome back to Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. One of the most poignant passages in that book is one of the little boys of one of the workers. They give them the passage is just absolutely revolting. The company, when it can't sell the meat because it's been deemed tainted, gives it to its employees in lieu of pay. It's like, hey, we're not going to pay as much this week, but here, have this sausage that has tuberculosis in it. And then one of the kids of one of the workers, little Christoforos, the child of, I believe it's a Latvian immigrant, dies from eating the sausage. So yes, a lot of these regulations are there for a good reason. Now, where did all these 41,000 regulations come from? Well, they're based on the passage of 200 state and federal laws, and also in response to 111,000 different lawsuits. Now, again, it's over the course of American history, and again, a lot of these lawsuits are redundant. Okay, there's probably been more than one lawsuit in the history of the United States over someone getting food poisoning from eating meat that had been in the fridge too long. So, probably more than 1,000 of them, in fact, when you're counting state, federal, etc., over the course of American history. Well, okay, over the course of a century and change, because I think the hamburgers only existed since 1895 or something like that. All right, so what do we make regulations on? This is going to be our closing slide. Well, there's 5 real reasons why you regulate something. Number one, and probably the most common one that you guys would have experienced, is making sure that business meets standards for cleanliness and safety. So, for example, to throw one out there, this is not a federal regulation, but it is a county one. If you go into a restaurant in LA County, you'll see a grade on the restaurant door or on the restaurant wall. That is their cleanliness grade by the LA County Department of Health, who goes in periodically. Now, I know someone who worked in the food industry, and I doubt it's changed that much since then. This is only about 5 years ago. They come in with a checklist of like 50, 60 things, and they check out each one. They only do this periodically because obviously this is a pretty big burden. You could only do, maybe a dozen of these a day tops. And there's, of course, LA County's 10 million people and God knows how many restaurants, right? But so it doesn't have, I think it has to happen annually. Maybe it's biannually. But anyway, they go in and they just, okay, check, check, check. This is here, this is here, this is here. Oh, this is not here, or we're not observing this. And if you don't get at least 90% of that checklist checked off, then you don't get an A. Over 90%, you get an A. If you get between 80 and 90%, you get a B. 70, 80%, you get a C. Below 70, you do not get a D. You no longer exist for a while. They actually close you down. Or there are a couple things that are automatic disqualifications. My favorite automatic disqualification is harboring of vermin, which makes it sound like you're keeping them as pets. It is not. It just means that they observed cockroaches, rats, mice, or droppings of same, and they close you till you can clean your stuff up. So there's an example of regulation that everybody here already knew. Or safety. If you go onto a construction site, you have to wear a hard hat. It led to one of the greatest pictures of all time, which got lost, and I don't know how. When Katie, our oldest, was a baby, my wife was working from home as an architect. She had to go on site at UCLA. That was her job at that moment, to do an inspection of one of the buildings that they were doing. And Katie was home from preschool because she was sick. So Christina takes her, to the place, and they demanded that they put a hard hat on the child. Well, the kid was about, I'm going to say Katie was 2, 3. So they didn't have a hard hat to fit, obviously. This thing went down over half of her head. It looked ridiculous. We took a great picture, though. The contrast of that was me. I was at a job site of hers in Las Vegas. This was in 2007. They're like, sir, you have to put a hard hat on. I'm like, oh, I'm just here observing. I'm not. No, it's a regulation. You have to do it. Well, I have a huge suitcase-sized head, as many of you have probably noticed and probably cruelly commented on social media. So they didn't have one that fit. So it kind of rested on top of my head. Would have done me no good if anything fell on my head, just would have hurt worse, but at least they had met the requirement. Okay, number 2, ensuring products meet a minimum standard for consumer health or consumer proper operation. This would be what we were just talking about with medications. Make sure it's sealed. Make sure you list all of the side effects. That also applies to number 5 on the list. I'll get to that in a bit. Proper operation. When you buy a consumer product, there's an expectation it's going to work. Like recall laws for cars is a good example of that. If within a certain number of months, and I can't remember, it's a high number. It's like 60 months, which is 5 years. If your car has a particular global defect. Now, a global defect does not mean that your car broke down so that they're on the hook to fix it. No. That's a warranty, and you pay for that, and it's totally separate. No, this is when they determine that a design flaw in your vehicle creates a problem that could happen to any car of that make and model. For example, the Jeep Cherokee I had, not the one I have now, which so far is knock on wood, problem-free. My old Jeep Cherokee, the middle seatbelt latch was not designed properly and could come out, which that's the worst seat to have a seatbelt issue with because person just goes right over the center console and through the windshield. So what they had to do is they had to agree to let anybody come into one of their dealerships, get that part fixed at the expense of the company. That's a great example of the second category regulation. Here's one that's just kind of funny because I can't believe it really exists, but it does. There is a regulation on the maximum acceptable failure rate for condoms. It is 0.4%, or 1 out of 250. Now, some of you with very dirty minds, and shame upon you, shame I say, are probably sitting there wondering, well, wait a second. How do you test that? Easy. You fill it up with air or water like a balloon. Get your mind out of the damn gutter. But 1 out of 250, and if so you get a whole batch. They make these things mass produced. I'm sure you guys knew that part. So they take aside a batch, and if two fail in a listing of 250 or in a patch of 250, they take the whole batch and throw it out. Number 3, limits on who can own certain businesses. You learned about this in U.S. history. Anti-monopoly laws fall in this category. There is a reason why in certain industries it's not advantageous to let someone own everything. Number 4, limits on who can work in certain fields. Licensing. My wife happens to come from an industry which has one of the hardest licensing exams of any profession in the state of California. Only the medical boards for, and I can't remember which field of medicine it is, have a higher failure rate than the state architect's exam, which I think at last check has about a 45% first-time failure rate. Why? Well, if someone's designing a building or supervising the construction of a building, they better know what they're doing or there could be grave danger, especially in a state of like California, where we have special issues like, earthquakes. California teachers have to be licensed. I am credentialed. I am licensed by the state of California. By the way, let me tell you what that means. For any of you who might be thinking of someday of going into teaching. It means a few different things. Number 1, you actually have to be fingerprinted. And they do this for a very simple reason, a reason that makes a ton of sense, which is they want to make sure that no one's walking onto a campus with a criminal record, particularly a criminal record in ways that could be harmful to children. Someone who dealt drugs or had sex crimes or something of that description. So you actually do have to be fingerprinted. And they do take the results into account whether or not to hire you or not hire you. I've had colleagues, not at Costa, so don't start pressing me for names the next time you see me. None of these were at Costa. But I had friends of mine who had arrests on their record. Nothing too serious. One was a possession offense when they were in college, and one was a public drunkenness when they were in college. One did not get hired by a district because of it. They just decided he was still young at that point and it was viewed as too big a risk. And one had to show evidence that they had gone to some form of rehab or therapy before they'd hire him. They can do that because, again, that's part of the process is, can you be a suitable teacher? There's also the regulation that you have to know your content. So you have to take a content area exam. You have to take classes in your content area. You do not necessarily have to be majored in that area. My brother was a history major and is a PE teacher, but he had to take an exam in physical education content in order to get a credential in PE. Here's another thing. If you want to become a teacher, you have to actually go practice teaching. Many of you have probably had what are known as student teachers. Student teachers are teachers who are awaiting certification who must demonstrate to an already credentialed teacher that they know what the hell they're doing. And indeed, that process is a process that can be failed. I have seen it happen. One of my student teachers wound up dropping out halfway through. That can happen. All right, number 5. And there are a few others. My favorite one is you used to have, I don't know if you still do, you used to have to be able to, you had to take a computer class, which was the easiest class I've ever taken in my life. Literally, like, here's where the power button is. This is this cool thing called Microsoft Word. No joke, it was amazing. Last but not least, rules requiring a free and fair exchange of information. So, nutrition labels on the side of your food that tell you what ingredients are in there and what, saturated fat and calories and percentages of the various good vitamins that you should consume in a day. That is a government requirement. Absent that, my guess is your fattier food outlets would probably not let you know that their food is heavily caloric and laden in fat. There's also ones, as I said a little bit earlier, about when you take a prescription, one of the requirements is that they have to tell you, they have to give you an information sheet with every potential side effect, side effect that medication has. And so that's another example of a government regulation requiring the exchange of information. When you buy a house, angry dogs. When you buy a house, that's another one. When you buy a house, they have to do what's called disclosures. And in the disclosures, they have to list, like, if the house has ever had water damage or fire damage or is in an earthquake-prone place, which in California, the answer to that is always yes. Here's one. I have a friend I used to coach with, lives up in Seattle, Washington. When he moved up there, he went to buy a house in Federal Way, which is a suburb of Seattle, And they had to disclose to him that the reason the house was vacant is because it had just been the site of a murder-suicide. Needless to say, my boy did not buy the house. And on that pleasant note, we're done. We come back next time. We talk about the different bureaucracies that exist in the federal system. Have a wonderful afternoon, evening, or morning, or whenever the hell this is, and I'll see you next time.